Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, the question is, why is Stacey Abrams struggling with black men? At least that's a question asked by a recent New York Times article, which laments that Abrams, who has long been championed as a strategic genius who architected the 2020 Georgia congressional wins that got Democrats the Senate, is falling behind in her own bid for governor. While Raphael Warnock is polling ahead of opponent Brian Kemp by about 5 points, the New York Times notes that Abrams is trailing and that her campaign lacks the, quote, energy of her congressional counterpart. Specifically, the Times points to poll results that show that black men, who are a key part of the constituency that brought Abrams so close to defeating Kemp in 2018, don't seem as motivated to vote for her this time around. And given how much the Democratic Party has praised Abrams for her ability to turn out voters in other people's elections, some are asking why she doesn't seem to be able to deliver for herself. Did she receive unwarranted or unearned praise for her role in the 2020 Georgia Senate races, praise that would be more accurately attached to less visible activists in the state? Or alternatively, is her own flailing electoral career evidence that the Democratic Party's choice to focus on expanding the black voter base rather than courting and persuading existing voters of all races is a bad one? Abrams' defenders are right to note that the comparison to Raphael Warnock's race is a little bit apples to oranges. Abrams faces an incumbent. Warnock has the incumbency. Warnock also has the advantage of teeing off against one of the weakest Republican candidates in the field. Herschel Walker, a former football player, politician, has been dogged by controversy. For example, he offered one of the more unique critiques of the Inflation Reduction Act, saying that, quote, a lot of money, it's going to trees, and we have enough trees. At one point, he used a laminated special deputy sheriff badge to burnish his fake law enforcement bona fides, and he's currently facing new television ads run by Democrats emphasizing violent threats he allegedly made against his ex-wife. There was even a sort of zany controversy about how many children the man actually has. Brian Kemp, by contrast, is a much less controversial figure to run against. Not only does he have the benefit of incumbency, he's been pushing back against Abrams by characterizing her as a sort of carpetbagger whose campaign is benefiting from the generosity of, quote, out-of-state billionaires. But to really understand what's going on here, beyond the simple identity story being sold by the Times, we have to take a closer look at the messaging promulgated by both campaigns, including TV ads. Kemp has issued ads attempting to tag Abrams to fund the police movement.
So do you support defunding the police?
I support the vision that is underlying that cry.
So yes to some defunding.
We have to reallocate resources, so yes.
In response, Abrams has said her remarks were taken out of context, and she has responded with her own ads touting her plan to support law enforcement if elected. Let's watch.
As a legislator, I worked with the GBI, with the Sheriff's Association, and with our police departments to ensure that they had the resources, the training, and the support they needed. I will support law enforcement, and law enforcement agrees.
She's also said she'd support raising some police salaries if elected, and that she'd expand training for officers specializing in mental health and social services. Now, you don't have to either support defunding the police or have a Blue Lives Matter flag flying in your house to think that this messaging is convoluted and completely lacking in credibility. Abrams quite rightly understood, as many of us did in the wake of George Floyd's on-camera murder, that increasing funding to the police while doing nothing to address the roots of crime leads to the kind of civil rights abuses that shocked the conscience of the nation in 2020. But instead of explaining what it would mean to spend government money more wisely, Democrats have been running away from sound criminal justice reform policy ever since, choosing instead to do a bad impersonation of Republicans that absolutely zero people believe. After hearing this ad, I'm not sure why the New York Times points to black men as the source of Abrams' problems and acts confused. It's obvious that the issue is one black woman, and her name is Stacey Abrams. Look, although as a progressive, I have long had substantive criticisms of Stacey Abrams, I've always admired her pure political skill. She came close to being the first black or female governor of Georgia in 2018 for a reason. Although her primary win was championed by many in liberal media as a win for so-called identity politics, she very smartly eschewed a hyper-specific racial message in her campaign, choosing instead to emphasize inclusiveness in her movement. As I wrote back in 2018 during Abrams' first run, quote, when Judy Woodruff of PBS NewsHour asked how Abrams planned to solicit non-voters, Abrams didn't pivot to identity-based issues. Instead, she called for education, jobs, and leaders committed to making sure government works for everyone. At the center of that, she said, is a conversation about expanding Medicaid in Georgia. If there's any doubt about who everyone includes, she went on to explain, quote, I want every voter in the state of Georgia. I want every independent thinking voter. When Woodruff asked Abrams to respond to a New York Times article claiming Abrams had signaled that she is unlikely to spend much time pleading with rural whites to come back to the Democratic Party, Abrams objected. Quote, that's a mischaracterization of the state. Number one, in rural communities in Georgia, it's a very diverse community. A third of rural Georgia is African American. She went on to emphasize that rural or suburban, most Georgians share the same values. She made clear that she would not pander to certain negative conservative impulses like xenophobia, saying I'm not going to pretend to be a conservative to win. But she didn't frame that laudable choice as prohibitive of creating a broad multiracial coalition. Stacey Abrams still displays that acute political intelligence. You can see it in a clip from her debate with Kemp that went viral just last week. Let's take a listen.
My question is, why are you encouraging people to break the law for you in this election?
Mr. Kemp, you are very aware that I know the laws of Georgia when it comes to voting. In fact, I am one of the foremost experts in the state on expansion of voting rights. And I have never in my life asked for anyone who is not legally eligible to vote to be able to cast a ballot. What I've asked for is that you allow those who are legally eligible to vote to allow them to cast their ballots. And in fact, we took you to court in 2016, and a federal judge said that you illegally canceled 34,000 registrations. You use the exact same system, the exact match system that is under dispute right now. Now, I realize that in the next response, you're going to say that it's a function of my organization because your tendency is to blame everyone else for the mistakes that you make. My responsibility as a leader is to see a problem and try to solve it. When I saw that we had 800,000 unregistered people of color in the state of Georgia, I started an organization that has reached into every county and increased those registrations. When I saw that people were being unlawfully denied the right to vote, I worked to make certain that we held you accountable. And as the next governor of Georgia, I will continue to do my job to make certain that every legally eligible vote that gets cast gets counted.
Whew, say what you want about her, but she is sharp. She can cut through false equivalences like butter. She can make an argument. Yale law, gotta give you a little credit. But being smart isn't what put Abrams on the map. What drew people to her was the perception that she was a real fighter for all people. But over the years since her first run, she has been framed by the Democratic Party as primarily an identity candidate, someone whose run will benefit Black voters, perhaps exclusively and implicitly to the detriment of white voters. And she's leaned into some of that herself as well. Compare her 2018 interview to this one, which followed Biden's MAGA Republican speech last week.
Lindsey Graham is not getting the rioting in the streets that he wants, but he does seem to have intensified Joe Biden's sense of urgency of what is at stake here.
I think that President Biden clearly articulated what is at stake, but I want to urge caution that we not be distracted by the carnival barkers that we see in a Donald Trump or Lindsey Graham, and we ignore those who are just as dangerous to democracy, like Ron DeSantis or Brian Kemp or Brad Raffensperger. It is not simply those who yell and scream that we need to be afraid of. It's those who are architecting the very overthrow of democracy that we are seeing play out across this country. And we know that in the state of Georgia, Brian Kemp has architected a bill that was promulgated across this country that is undermining elections as we speak, because it is making it difficult for voters to be able to cast their ballots and have those ballots counted. We know that right now thousands of Georgia voters have been challenged because of an unlimited elector challenge process that was put in place by Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger. We know that Black county election officials were removed from their offices because of SB 202. And we need to make certain that we understand that the slow motion erosion of our democracy does not require the loud and raucous behavior that Lindsey Graham threatened. It also happens when the sitting governor refuses to testify in a trial and instead seeks to quash the subpoena that is summoning his voice until after an election because he doesn't want the electorate to hear what he has to say.
Look, Abrams makes compelling points about real attempts at undermining an election result that absolutely must be addressed. But it has consumed her entire messaging, crowding out the substantive conversation she used to do so well. A conversation that let all Georgians, rural and urban, white and black, male and female, know that Abrams would fight for them. Democrats want Abrams to embody the least political viable path, it seems. They want to frame her as a radical justice hero whose focus is voting rights, while downplaying the appeals to economic populism that she used to make. At the same time, they want her to tack right on criminal justice issues, joining Biden in his cause to fund the police harder, even as Republicans are calling to defund the FBI. Instead of living genuinely in her truth and pointing out that increasing funding to the police does not correlate with lower crime rates, that it's an issue of big government waste, and that the money would be better spent on programs proven to prevent crime in the first place, instead of pointing to the events in Uvalde as evidence of police ineptitude and the civil liberties violations that police heap on poor people of all races, she is juggling a clumsy message of police are good, actually. That wins her no votes and loses her credibility with the very constituency she's apparently failing with, black men. The Times notes that Abrams' campaign has begun a series of conversations with black men, calling the events Stacey and the Fellas. She's conscripted local celebrities like Atlanta rapper Young Jock and radio personality Big Tigger. At one event, she said bluntly, if black men vote for me, I'll win Georgia. But why would they? Georgia's incarceration rate is especially bad, even in the context of the United States, which imprisons more people than any other country in the world, including China, which is many times bigger and which is regularly criticized by Americans for authoritarianism. And for $32,000 a year, the cost of incarcerating someone in Georgia, I think many people across the political spectrum would support sentencing inmates to, punishing semesters at Berkeley rather than the state penitentiary. 58% of Georgia's prison population is black. 400,000 Georgians are on probation, bringing the total number of residents who are under some kind of criminal justice supervision to over 500,000 people. That's 400,000 voters, disproportionately black males, that Abrams is pitching with a message that emphasizes fund the police over the inequities that resulted in a mass incarceration crisis. Make it make sense. Democrats seem to believe that they can thread the needle of ignoring the interests of black voters while emphasizing the value of having someone with a diverse identity in office. But this has the effect of alienating white voters who see nothing for them in the historic nature of Abrams' candidacy. And black people are unhappy with this too. White people are unhappy with this. Black people are unhappy with this. Who wins other than the smug consultant class of the Democratic Party who champion this demographics is destiny narrative instead of substantive politics? Abrams is flagging because she's given up on persuasion, the thing she was actually good at before the Democratic Party got its claws on her. But here's what really makes me crazy. Instead of acknowledging a substantive critique of her campaign, the liberal media is blaming black men, calling them misogynistic, even though Abrams is also falling behind with black women. According to the recent Atlanta Journal-Constitution poll, Abrams is only polling at about 80% with black voters overall. Democrats need about 90% of the black vote to survive in the state. Only the very last line in an article focusing on Abrams' low black turnout provides a real clue as to why she's falling behind. It reads, quote, one possible reason for the lagging support for Democrats, nearly 1/3 of black voters disapprove of President Joe Biden's record as president. Well, now we're cooking with fire and common sense. Abrams has tied herself to Biden's anti-black big police state agenda. Instead of co-signing Biden's worst instincts, she should fight for the people of her state. Call Biden out for reneging on his promise to send out $2,000 checks if Georgia voters want him the Senate. Call him out for reneging on his promise to cancel all student loan debt for graduates of public universities and HBCUs earning less than $125,000 a year. Show some of the fighting spirit and understanding of the diverse, multifaceted needs of rural and urban Georgians in your state. And distance yourself from the albatross that is Joe Biden, a man who has never been a friend to Black people. I suspect Abrams won't follow this advice and that she'll lose, but what a waste it will be, because she really has political talent and, as a younger woman, displayed some real progressive populist bona fides. Somehow the left will be blamed for Abrams' pivot right, and Democratic voters will be propagandized by corporate media drones into believing that Abrams' loss is evidence that progressive politics can't win, and that they should double down on running fake conservatives nobody wants instead of real populists. It's failing in Florida with ex-Republican turned Democratic opportunist Charlie Crist, just as it failed with a number of blue dogs who lost down ballot in 2020. And meanwhile, disgruntled Democrats will continue to find other, more conservative outlets to express their preferences for common sense economic populism. Don't say you haven't been warned.
Yeah, I was never as impressed with Stacey Abrams as virtually anyone else, I guess. I was confused when she was being put on like magazine cover after magazine cover. Felt like a lot of eggs being put in one basket, just an expectation that she's going to be a national Democratic figure, even though she never quite got there. I mean, she did pretty well that first time, but I mean, close enough doesn't matter. She didn't win. And
100%.
She's really going to lose this time.
Yeah, 100%. So I had just joined The Intercept, started my journalism career when her last race was happening. And what I observed at the time was that there was this huge gap between how she was being covered and framed in her primary race with Stacey. They were both named, they had the same name. I think they both had the same last name. But the other woman was white. And Stacey Abrams was framed as being this identity politics candidate who was, running on being the first and all of this stuff. But when I actually looked at their material, Abrams was very disciplined in talking about, an inclusive message, white voters a part of it, rural voters a part of it. And it was her opponent who kept talking about being raised in a trailer park. She had this ad she got in trouble for because it superimposed Martin Luther King's face on her face. It was like a mess. There was a lot of this really hard identity messaging. And what I learned is that a lot of pundits, they'd simply say, oh, a Black person is in this is an identity candidate. And it wasn't fair to Stacey at the time. And I think her success was largely because she had a populist message. But now, 4 years later, it seems as though she has become a creation of the Democratic Party machine with all of those magazine covers and stuff. And she's leaned into that to her detriment.
She leaned into it. She was pushed to lean into it, but she leaned into it nevertheless.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Briahna, and we'll have more Rising right after this.